Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and today we're doing something a little bit different. I brought a special guest onto the show to talk about the Streets of New Capenna commander decks and run through them. Welcome to the show, Chris Mooney. How you doing, Chris?
Hello, I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
All right, Chris, so who are you and what do you do at Wizards? What's your background like and what do you do?
So I am Chris Mooney. I am a card designer. I do card design in a variety of different things. I have led commander products, vision design teams. I've done a lot of set design. So really just kind of all over parts of the process of the lifespan of a Magic set I've been involved in. Additionally, I am the white color pie counselor. So that means on the Council of Colors, who is the group within Wizards that is sort of in charge of making sure that everyone is, following the color pie, adding and removing effects from colors as we think they need them in various different formats. I'm the person who's sort of responsible for white in that context.
And this was your first lead design, right?
That's right. This is my first full sort of product that I was the lead designer on. There are a couple of other smaller teams that I had led before this, but this was the first time that I really went through the full process, beginning to end, and kind of went through the entire thing, learned about all the different steps, and got to see cards that I was largely responsible for actually make it to print and get out there into the wild.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Chris was the lead designer of the Streets of New Capenna commander decks. Now, they had a great team of people working with them. I was one of them. We'll talk about that more in a second. But they led design the 5 decks, and I thought, hey, the decks are pretty new. Why not bring them onto the show and talk about all the cool stuff we got to do with the decks and run through the cards one by one and kind of tell all the stories behind the 17 new cards in the deck and some of the reprints. So Chris, to kind of kick things off a little bit, we found out initially there were going to be 5 decks, one for each family. That made a lot of sense. How did we go about going from there? What was the next thing that we did?
Right. So generally speaking, the first part of any commander design team is figuring out what the decks are going to be. Typically that involves both mechanical theme and color. But in this case, we already knew what the colors were going to be because that was the whole theme of the set, was the 5 3-colored families. And we also had a pretty good idea of what direction we wanted to go in mechanically, because commander products tend to start their development kind of halfway through the lifespan of the Magic set. So that means that a lot of work has already been done laying the groundwork of like, what are these factions going to be about? What are the main mechanical themes? Obviously, everything changes a little bit, but we knew going in kind of the general gist of what each of them was going to do. So really, the job came down to just taking those colors and that loose mechanical theme and seeing, hey, if we put these together in a commander environment, where does that take us?
Right, so 5 decks and 5 themes. So maybe this could be 5 episodes of the show. If you like this, please let us know in the comments down below and let us know which deck you want us to do next. If you don't like it, let us know and we won't do any more of them. So it could go either way. Let us know what you think. It's kind of like a companion to Melissa's show where we're going back through the old commander decks. This is like a pincer maneuver. We're going down through the new commander deck. So we'll meet in the middle somewhere. But anyway, let's kick it off today by talking about one deck in particular, and that is Bedecked Brokers. So this is the green, white, blue deck based on the Brokers. So you mentioned a moment ago that we kind of took themes from the main set. Talk about how shield counters, a theme from the main set, ended up playing out in this counter kind of deck.
Right. So spoilers a little bit. You can see how some of the commanders in this product are really on theme with their factions, set mechanic. But others of them kind of took a little bit of a different path, or maybe don't even have the set mechanic on them. Perry kind of ended up a little bit in the middle here. Essentially, the shield counters were the theme of the Brokers faction in the main set. And shield counters are pretty fun, but they can get pretty frustrating if you have too many of them. If there's just shield counters on all of your stuff all of the time, maybe you're proliferating them, adding a ton of them on, that's fun some of the times, but we were really struggling to come up with a commander that did that reliably, but also didn't just bog the game down and everyone, taking forever to attack. And then, of course, if you play a board sweeper, all of your creatures get to stick around. So now that's a very powerful, very repetitive gameplay state. So we said, we don't want to make a deck that is all about shield counters. We don't think that's going to be very fun. What else can we do? So counters are like a well-trod space within the commander environment. Many people already have counters decks. So we're looking for, all right, well, if we want to incorporate shield counters, what is something we could do that maybe spices this up a little bit, takes counters in a new direction that we haven't been in before? And we came up with this idea of what if you were counting different kinds of counters? You were looking for as many different kinds of counters you could put in your deck as possible. That seemed really fun. It seemed like it worked well because shield counters was a brand new type of counter you could add to that list. And it brought in a lot of kind of lesser known, maybe lesser played cards, which is always something that we love to see in commander decks, when we can take old cards that maybe haven't seen the light of day in a while and sort of bring them back into relevance by introducing something new to the format.
Yeah, and there's so many fun old counters in this deck. You have like Wall of Roots with the -0, -1 counter. You've got hoofprint counters, all kinds of fun stuff. And just to go back there for a second, yeah, I remember so early on in the design team, so Scott Larrabee led this deck. Chris led the whole product, but on the way the team worked is there were 5 designers, one for each deck, and each designer kind of managed their own deck, and then Chris kind of oversaw how all the decks turned out. And I remember Scott saying, well, we can make this like a +1/+1 counters deck or something like that uses these kind of traditional kinds of counters. And it really was through his version and us honing in on it that we were like, what if we looked at all these different kind of counters, which is so unique and something we've never done really in Magic before, at least not on a grand scale. But the other thing about shield counters that makes it hard too is there's no other shield counter cards in Magic. So if we made a shield counter deck, well, it could use some cards from the main set, and we could blow most of our 17 new cards on shield counters, but then you're kind of just done. You've got like this one little deck in a box. We're looking at all kinds of other counters, lets you use all kinds of wacky stuff, which I totally love. Do you have a favorite returning counter type or favorite card that puts on weird counters in this set, Chris?
Well, I will say Wall of Roots is definitely high up there for me. I think when we remembered that Wall of Roots had this bespoke counter that was really only used on this one card, that was very delightful for us. I would say in play testing, the one that really stood out the most was the Aven Mimeomancer, who puts a feather counter on something and turns it into a 3/1 flyer. That one was fun, not only from the kind of hilarious image of this wizard coming in and turning you all into birds, but it also ended up being fairly strong because the deck has sort of, it wants to attack, it gets lots of stats. And so turning your creatures into flyers was actually really synergistic with a lot of what was going on.
I'll say, Chris, that is big shield sphere erasure. You're saying that Wall of Roots is the only card with -0, -1 counters. I think there's a few other lesser werewolf maybe too, but we'll let it slide. We'll let it slide this time around. Any other fun reprints that we found for this deck that you thought were really neat or cool to have around? There's all the cool counter types, of course. Like I love the brick counters or whatever that we found. But any cards in particular that you're like, oh, I'm so glad we got to put that in this deck?
Well, certainly I think the one that right from the very beginning that we wanted to put in was Crystalline Giant. I mean, this is sort of the poster child from Ikoria about using keyword counters. It has pretty much all of the keyword counters that at least existed at the time on it. And it just seemed like such a slam dunk. We weren't exactly sure. We tested around. We weren't sure if it should go in, but at last we were sort of like, no, this is too much fun. It is exactly what the deck wants. Let's put it in there. And even though it can sometimes be challenging to randomize which counter you're going to get, the deck was just so happy to have it there.
And I'm so glad that we also have the new Commander deck box technology where you have the little punch out counters in there. Because man, when you start playing this deck, that is super useful to have a bunch of counters out of the box and naming all those.
Right. One thing that constantly came up with this deck, which I always thought was very funny, was people would play it and they would be like, wow, this deck was really cool. It was really unique. It was really fun. There was a lot of bookkeeping. And I was like, this is the lawyer faction. So if anyone is going to like bookkeeping, I think it's going to be this faction.
Flavorful on so many axes. Well, okay, we've got 17 new cards to get through. So let's go through all the new cards. And what better place to kick it off with than with Perry, the Pulverizer himself, the face commander, which tells you a lot about what's going on in this deck. So I'll kind of read it off to everyone out there. It's 1 green, white, blue for a 3/3 legendary creature Rhino Soldier. When Perry enters the battlefield, you put a shield counter on target creature, so he can target himself or something else, or even one of their creatures if you're so inclined. And whenever Perry attacks, target creature you control gains trample and gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of different kinds of counters among permanents you control. Now, I remember, Chris, this went through a lot of iteration, a lot of discussion. Take me through the long journey that the Pulverizer had here.
Yeah, so Perry cared about different kinds of counters on your cards right from the very beginning, but finding the right reward for that was very challenging. Especially because one of the things that is unique about counting different kinds of counters is that it really is reliant on exactly what cards you draw. If you draw a hand that has 3 or 4 different kinds of counters in it, you could be off to an amazing start. And if you draw a hand that maybe only has one kind of counter in it, then that's a lot weaker. So one of the things we did when we were making Perry was wanting to make sure that we wanted him to scale with the number of different kinds of counters you had, but not in such a way that being a high number got you up a ton of resources or, a ton of speed over having a low number of counters. That way, sort of, you could still have those awesome starts where it felt like you just had this amazing draw. But also, if you had a slower draw, you weren't so far behind in terms of how much power your commander was able to give you.
Yeah, and so what were some of the different versions we went through with Perry? Because I know it changed a decent amount. It was bigger and smaller and counted different things at different points in time to give different bonuses. What were some other versions you remember?
That's right, man. Perry went through so many different changes in terms of, there was a cost reduction version. There was a version that I think was putting the counters on himself. So he there are a lot of different things that we went through. I think that about halfway through, we realized that having this combat bonus is really what we wanted to do, partially because we like to create commanders that push the game forward. They allow things to reach a conclusion, and having a commander that, hey, build up all of these silly kinds of counters, sometimes that doesn't lead to actually winning the game or making progress. So we really wanted Perry to have that component to him. Additionally, something that a lot of people will see if they look at cards in the main set, shield counters are very good at protecting your creatures and making them good at blocking. So one of the things that we did when we designed shield counters cards was trying to lean them all towards attacking. If you look at the cards with shield counters, a lot of them say, when this creature attacks, do something, or on your turn, you get some kind of bonus. So similarly, we thought that Perry would be in the best space if he had an attack trigger that was saying, hey, you get a shield counter, you get to protect your creatures, but you shouldn't just sit back and defend. No, you should start getting in there and, pulverizing people.
Yeah, great analysis on that. And you're totally right. It's easy to hang back when you have a bunch of counters. A card that forces you to attack is important to get its bonus, especially in Commander Precon games too, where often you need a little bit of that incentive to attack to help make sure the game ends. And Perry does that in spades. Speaking of attacking, let's go on to the second in command for this deck. So every deck has one kind of backup commander you can use if you don't want to use the face, or if you want to play in a different way. And that is Cross, the defense contractor. 1 green, white, blue, so same mana cost as Perry, for a 2/4 legendary creature cat advisor. Cross says, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a shield counter on target creature an opponent controls. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, tap that creature and goad it. It gains trample until your next turn. Talk to me about Cross and where this came from.
So one of the overarching themes of Streets of New Capenna Commander was politics. So politics is a part of every Commander game, and some players like it more, some players like it less. We make a couple of political cards, every now and then, but every once in a while, a theme comes along that really speaks to you. And for Streets of New Capenna, I was really inspired by the theme of these crime families in this world who are wheeling and dealing and making back alley deals. It just felt like the right place to make some politically themed cards. So I decided that I wanted to kind of push a little bit harder than usual into making some political options. And one of the ways that we did that was by making the secondary commander in each of these decks a political card. So Cross here takes that theme of counters, but then says, all right, what if instead of just building up counters on my own, which, we already have lots of options for that. What if instead I'm giving counters away to other people, and in exchange, they're going to attack one of my opponents for me.
And I think it's also nice that you give the counter to their creature. So it's like, hey, you have to attack somebody, but your creature's not going to die because it's got the shield counter, right? So it's kind of like a feel-good goad moment where you goad their thing, they're forced to attack with it. But even if it runs into a much larger creature, your thing's still going to be just fine.
That's right. Oftentimes with Cross, you will be putting a shield counter on maybe the largest, scariest creature in order to make sure it goes somewhere else. But every now and then you'll give an offer to the table. Hey, who wants a shield counter on their creature? You've got some creature that you really want to get the attack trigger off, but we all have blockers. Well, how about I shield that for you? you got to go attack someone else, but in exchange, you're going to get to keep your creature alive for another turn cycle.
Now, I was trying to remember where this card came from. I think this was a Scott Larrabee design was the genesis of this. Is that right? Do you remember?
It's difficult to remember just exactly where every card came from, but that does sound correct. I feel like when we gave out that idea of let's make some political cards, this was probably one that Scott came up with.
Yeah, I remember. I think Scott pitched this one, and he loved the idea of like putting shield counters on their creatures and goading them. It went through a couple iterations here or there, but the genesis of his idea stayed the same. So hats off to Scott for this really fun backup commander.
Now, this card, when people see it, they're often reminded of Generous Patron, which is a card from Battle Bond that let you draw when you gave counters out to other people. This is a card that I think people use every now and again, but hopefully it and other cards like it will have a new home with Crosshair.
So speaking of legends, there's also one legend in every deck that can't command the deck. It's like a bonus legend. If you want to go build a different kind of deck, you can go grab this legend and go play it somewhere else. And there is one for this deck, of course, and that is Denry Kiln, Editor-in-Chief. Denry Kiln, Editor-in-Chief is 2 white-blue for a 2/2 legendary creature cat advisor. Denry Kiln, Editor-in-Chief enters the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 for a strike or vigilance counter on it. And whenever a non-token creature you control enters the battlefield, if Denry has counters on it, put the same number and kind of counters on that creature. So it shares its counters around. Tell me about this card, Chris.
Right. So when it came to the bonus legend for each of the decks, something that we were looking for was to call back to the 2-color themes in the main set. So for anyone who, maybe isn't super familiar with Streets of New Capenna main set, it is a 3-color, we have these 3-color crime families, but the overlaps of the families are these 2-color archetypes. And those archetypes sort of play a large role in the limited environment. And so we thought it might be fun to make some ally-colored creatures, which are the overlaps, and take the themes from the main set and use those as the inspiration for these creatures. So Denry Kiln here is inspired by the main set theme of white-blue counters. So Denry here enjoys you having lots of counters, putting them on himself, and then is able to spread them out to your other creatures. So similar to, he fits in with what the rest of the deck is doing, but also offers a totally new sort of angle to the theme.
Yeah, and it's really awesome with all the kinds of keyword counters you can grant and so many other fun ways, right? You can put a indestructible counter on your creature and then they're suddenly all indestructible, right? Which is really cool and a lot of fun. I'll be shameless and take the credit for this one. This was my design that I'm really glad turned out how it did. It went through a few tweaks, a bunch of wording change stuff, as happens in design. But the core of the idea stayed the same, of this creature that gives its counters to other creatures, which I think is really fun and should hopefully create some fun blue-white decks out there. Another thing we're always looking for are different kinds of decks you could build, and blue-white didn't really have a counters deck so much, and now you can take Denry and go build blue-white counters and see what that does at your local commander table. Moving right along to the next card here, we're going to look at Angelic Sleuth. So we're going to go through the rest in color order here. Angelic Sleuth is 2 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, creature angel advisor. Whenever another permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, investigate. Talk to me about this one, Chris.
Yeah, so this card started out being called Claims Investigator. And essentially the idea was, one of the things that happens when you have a counters-based deck is that you'll have all your stuff, you'll have all your counters on, and then some big board sweeper will come in and just ruin your day. You'll lose all your stuff and you'll have nothing to show for it. So a lot of the cards that we made were really trying to help counteract that occurrence that happens quite often with these decks. Angelic Sleuth is an example of a card where if your stuff with counters on it goes away, you'll get some clues, which you can sort of use to recover from that card advantage loss. Angelic Sleuth also helps to show off something new that we're doing, which is allowing white to investigate more. Clues are something that kind of allow you to draw cards, but in a way that is pretty slow. You have to pay mana to do it. You often won't be able to draw many cards in the same turn if you're making a lot of clues. And so we like this as one of the ways that we're allowing white to draw cards that feels sort of natural with the limitations that we want to be placed on the color.
Yeah, and you can draw a lot of cards from this. We got to hop through the hoop of having a counter on your creature first, and it draws it in a very white way, which is all those clue tokens. Talk to me about the leaves the battlefield on this as opposed to dies. Is there a reason why we did that direction here?
Right. So this deck has a lot of shield counters, and shield counters are very good at protecting you from destroy effects or from damage effects. But one of the weaknesses of shields, or maybe one of the only weaknesses of shields, is that effects that bounce your creatures or exile them or even blink them you are going to lose all of your counters when any of those things happen. They get around the protection of shields. So we liked having this card leaves the battlefield so that even if your opponents were able to find ways around your shield counters, you at least got some compensation for it.
That's a very clever bit of counterplay, which is a counter joke I can only make once this episode. So I'm spending it right here. And hopefully it doesn't come back to bite me later on. All right, so that was Angelic Sleuth. Now let's move on to Contractual Safeguard. Addendum, if you cast this spell during your main phase, put a shield counter on a creature you control. This is a returning mechanic, which is kind of cool. And then choose a kind of counter on a creature you control, put a counter of that kind on each other creature you control. What's the story of this card?
One of the things that you'll probably notice looking through the set is that there are a lot of old returning magic mechanics here. When I started to lead this product, one of the things I did was go back to the history of Magic and say, hey, we've made a lot of mechanics over the years. This is a setting that has so much flavor. I want to see if any of these old mechanics could be brought back to fit within this world. And this was one of the first examples we thought of. Addendum is a very lawyery sounding word. It is a very lawyery mechanic from the Azorius on Ravnica. And in this plane, we also have a faction of magical lawyers. So it just felt right to try and do an addendum card here. I think overall, a lot of the ones that we came up with, I was super happy with. This one was one of the first ones we made, and I think it came out great. This card also kind of shows off what we tried to do with shield counters, which is say, hey, getting a lot of shield counters can be pretty powerful. We don't want to just give it to you that easily. So this card can put a shield counter on all of your creatures, but only if you do it in your main phase, which means that you can't really use it to respond to a mass removal spell, for example. But the fact that it has addendum means it can also be cast as an instant. And hey, if you have other counters in play, like a +1/+1 counter, a keyword counter, or even another shield counter from a different card in your deck, then you can start doing those tricksy stuff at instant speed. So this was sort of inspired just by us wanting to reuse addendum, which we felt flavorfully fit perfectly here. But the design too also worked really well with shields.
One of the things I always talk about set designers is I always view people who design sets kind of like a showrunner for a TV show, right? They'll hand out the overarching plot of the entire show, and then the person will go in and like write an episode that fits the plot that they're trying to go for. And in Magic design, there's a lot of good principles that we try and do, and like a lot of shapes of things will end up somewhat similar depending on, you know, the goals of the set. But it's the lead designer or the showrunner who's the person that gets to go and kind of add their flair and their spice into what they're working on. And one of the things that Chris loves is returning mechanics. And I had so much fun working on this set with kind of their flair being loving returning mechanics. If you find anything that could be a reasonable fit, put it in here. And the fact that we got to bring back mechanics like Addendum, or we'll get to it eventually, but Cypher are just like I never thought we'd see some of these again, right? So really cool and helps make it feel like this almost like modern Horizons-ish traveling through space and time, which I love.
It definitely has a little bit of Modern Horizons flair to it. But I think also something to realize is that a lot of old mechanics, they don't really have a full Magic set's worth of cards left in them. So it's unlikely that we're going to bring Addendum, for example, back for another time in the prime time. But I really love giving these old mechanics new life when we can do one or two cards here or there that feel like they really fit what's going on and allow us to explore that design space, what little is left, at a good pace.
Right, like Addendum didn't even have a full set worth of cards in the first place. It was like an Azorius mechanic on like, I'm going to take a random guess, 8 cards, something like that. And it's like, okay, well, now we get to put another one here. And for everyone out there, they have their favorite mechanic, and sometimes they're ones they're never going to see again, right? People all the time are like, I love Provoke, or I love Cypher, or I love Haunt, or whatever. And maybe someday they'll see another one of these cards. So I'm glad we could give them a Addendum card here. Next up is a board sweeper that fits perfectly in this deck. 3 white, sorcery. Destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Chris, talk to me about this.
Right. So as Magic designers, oftentimes we're looking to do something totally new, totally creative that is breaking into unexplored design space. Other times you're looking for a short and sweet, simple card that just really gets the point across. And this is an example of one of those. We were like, hey, what kind of wrath would a deck with a bunch of counters in it want? What about a wrath that just kills everything without counters on it? And so we pretty much wrote this in. We loved it from the very beginning, and it stuck all the way through.
Right. I think the biggest thing that happened is we like chopped a mana off of it, right? It was 6 mana at one point, then we brought it down to 5. Maybe we talked about if it should be non-land permanents or creatures, right? Maybe that happened.
Right. I think there was a discussion on whether we wanted to do, like 5 mana creatures or like 6 or 7 mana and all permanents. Ultimately, though, I think that ending up with the cheaper card that hit creatures was the right way to go, especially since one that hit all permanents would be really, really strong if you only had planeswalkers in play, for example.
Yeah, this is definitely the kind of thing, too, where, I mean, designers can type on their keyboards and make wacky cards all day long. Finding a good, not used 8-word card in Magic is really hard to do for a rare in a commander deck. And whenever you find one, you're like, oh, here's a diamond in the rough that I figured out. And I saw this and immediately was like, oh yeah, that's perfect. That's great for this deck. Let's do it here. And it's nice because in certain kind of decks, it's going to be amazing. And in mini decks, it like won't be anything special. And I think that's a great place for like a board sweeper to live in.
And I'll also just call out, it's also very difficult to find flavor text that is this short and snappy. So I think overall the pieces really came together on this card.
Now, speaking of typing on a keyboard and having things come out, making long, wacky cards, let's talk about Resourceful Defense, a card which went through a ton of iteration and definitely is a little on the wackier side. 2 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. 4 and a white, move any number of counters from target permanent you control to another target permanent you control. So some counter moving around, big Ozolith vibes. What's happening here, Chris?
Right. So as I mentioned on a previous card, one of the things that this deck always ran into, and pretty much counter decks run into in general, is having all your stuff in play with lots of counters on it and then getting all your stuff killed. So we really wanted to try and make a couple of cards that were going to help alleviate this issue. And this is one of them. This card not only lets you win, kind of adds a little modularness to your deck where if one thing dies, you can put the counter somewhere else. But also, if all of your creatures die at once, it itself can suck up all the counters and store them until you've got something else to move them onto.
Yeah, and if I remember, this went through a lot of changes, right? So what were some of the other versions of this that we tried?
It's hard to name just one version of this card because I think almost every part of this was tweaked at some point in time, depending on, what was the timing of getting to moving things? What was the cost? Were there restrictions on what you could move? We tried so many different things. And in fact, I believe that this is probably sort of the most open and sort of unrestricted version that we ended up with. A lot of the versions that we were trying out before, we wanted to kind of make it cheaper or make it a little bit more efficient, but we ended up saying, you know what, this card is more satisfying when it just kind of covers all the bases and we'll make it cost appropriate amount of mana.
Yeah, I remember it was like a lot more. It had a trigger at one point, right, where you could only move the counters on one per turn. You move like one counter off at a turn or something like that.
I think an early version was looking for like one of each kind of counter, so it like really mattered. Like it was trying to play into that theme of capturing the variety of counters in your deck, so it was like you could only store one of them at a time, or when something. Anyway, there are a lot of more complicated, harder to play versions, and I think ultimately we ended up with the one that is both simplest and probably the strongest as well.
Yeah, as designers, we like trying out things that are super specific or really get at the theme sometimes, but it often makes a lot of sense to just drill it back to, hey, what's the most straightforward version of this card? And this card already has a ton of other stuff going on, so making the most straightforward version is not a problem by any stretch of the imagination. Moving on to our next card, we've got Sky Boon Evangelist. 4 and a white for a 3/3 bird advisor with flying. When Sky Boon Evangelist enters the battlefield, support 6. Whenever a creature with a counter on it attacks one of your opponents, that creature gains flying until end of turn. And if you don't know what support does, which I wouldn't blame you for, I think we last saw it in Battle Bond, it says put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 6 other target creatures. So for the most of the time, it's going to put a counter on all your other creatures, although if you have more than 6 creatures, you got to choose 6 of them. Talk to me about this one.
Right. So something that people often forget about support is that support comes from Battle Bond, which was a set all about trying to help out another player, in that case, your partner. But when you play support in Commander, you can put counters on your opponent's creatures. And that's what Sky Boon Evangelist is sort of here to do. Now, you won't often give away those counters for free. You might ask for something in exchange, but Sky Boon Evangelist gives anything with a counter on it flying, as long as it's attacking not you, which means that you might put a +1/+1 counter on your opponent's 8/8 ground creature, and now all of a sudden it is way more threatening to everyone else at the table instead of yourself. this is one of those cards that I was talking about in terms of trying to push a little bit more politics than usual. This card is totally fine and functional if you're never using it to politics, but it gives you the option to do that. So in many ways, this card is kind of like Cross's right-hand bird.
Yes, indeed. I think you make a great point too, that like, right, in Oath of the Gatewatch and Battle Bond, we just saw support as putting counters on your own stuff. But here it's nice to open up that a little more and give it, find a way to give it out to other people and spread that politics out further. I remember, I think one of the last versions of this card was like counting the number of opponents you had, and then you supported twice that many times. And this is another great example of drilling it down to just support 6, a lot more straightforward, a lot more understandable, and just do some pretty cool stuff. Moving right along, we'll go to Aven Courier, a simple but powerful card. 1 blue for a 1/1 flying bird advisor. Lots of birds here. Makes sense, I guess, when Falco's heading up your faction. It has flying, and whenever Aven Courier attacks, choose a counter on a permanent you control. Put a counter of that kind on target permanent you control if it doesn't have a counter of that kind on it. So basically, when it attacks, you pick a counter, and then you put a counter of that kind on another permanent, so it kind of shares your counters around. Talk to me about the Aven Courier.
Right. So as I'm sure many players who play counter decks know, Thrumming Bird is a great card that allows you to proliferate. Proliferate, super fun with counters. However, it only really stacks up counters that you already have. That's, in fact, the whole point of Proliferate. But this was a deck that it didn't really want to have a bunch of the same kind of counter on one card, because if that card went away, then you lost that kind of counter. So we really wanted to try and make a card that was going to allow you to move your counters around and kind of get good coverage. If I have 4 creatures with a vigilance counter on them, then if one of them goes away, I still have a vigilance counter in play, which counts for Perry, but also allows me to keep putting vigilance counters on my other creatures. So Aven Courier is really born out of that idea of a Thrumming Bird style card that was better suited for spreading counters out as opposed to piling them up on the same things.
Right, and you only play so many Thrumming Birds too, so if you want more Thrumming Bird kind of stuff, this is a great one for you to have with a bunch of added flexibility on there too. And I think it's no coincidence it has the same stat line as Thrumming Bird. A 2-mana 1/1 is just a great space for this. It comes down early, and they can share out those counters a little bit wider. And the fact that Perry gives you an automatic shield counter really helps make sure that it can protect plenty of your stuff. Let's talk about Shield Broker next. This is the next card here. 3 blue for a 3/4 Cephalid Advisor, so the return of Cephalids. When Shield Broker enters the battlefield, put a shield counter on target non-commander creature you don't control. You gain control of that creature for as long as it has a shield counter on it. So talk to me about this, and I'd love to hear about the non-commander bit of this, because I think that's pretty interesting.
Right. So for starters, this was one of the early designs. Scott might have come up with this one as well. When we heard about shield counters, we really tried to get creative in how we could use them. Obviously, you can have creatures that enter with shield counters, but the main set was already doing a lot of that. We really wanted to try and break new ground. And many Magic players really like to steal their opponent's stuff. But that can also be a very frustrating gameplay experience. So whenever we try to make new cards in that space, we're always looking for what's a way that we can do it that sort of is maybe a little bit less frustrating, but not necessarily less powerful. So Shield Broker is a great example of a card where you get to steal something and you're giving it a shield. The stealing effect is quite strong, but also if your opponent is able to knock the shield off, they get their card back. However, this is also a card that, because it has this fairly strong enter the battlefield effect, if you're able to continuously blink it or return it to your hand and replay it, you're able to steal a lot of creatures. So it sits in that space of kind of working both ways. You get an upside of having a really strong enter the battlefield effect on a reasonably efficient creature, with the downside of the stealing effect not being permanent. Now, granted, if you find a way to maybe proliferate those shield counters or add extra shield counters on them, now that creature is going to be under your employ for quite a long time. In terms of the non-commander element of this card, whenever we make cards that steal things, one of the things we're always careful about is that getting your commander stolen is a very frustrating experience, because you built your whole deck around that. And most other forms of removal that get rid of commanders allow you to put your commander back into the command zone, and stealing does not. So on some of these cards that we're making commander products, we're starting to put non-commander as a restriction so that you can still use this to steal lots of you can still use this to steal lots of exciting creatures, but you can't use it to sort of turn off somebody's deck.
Yeah, I think that's really important to make sure that people can play their game, because often you build your entire deck around your commander, and if it's stolen, they could just not attack or block with it, leave it over here, and then you're basically out of doing anything with your commander. So, I mean, there's lots of cards in Magic that can steal any creature, don't get me wrong, those aren't going to go away, but in commander products specifically, on a card like this, calling out non-commander makes a lot of sense to me. I also think I'll note again that just like the backup base commander Cross, it's really cool that you take their thing, it's shielded, but when the shield counter is removed, it's still alive and it goes right back to them, right? So they will get their thing back eventually. It's just under your employment for, a little bit of time. I think that's a pretty nice design. This was a design I remember seeing and immediately being like, that's awesome. I love it. I think the only thing we changed is we made it bigger and added a mana to it, right? I think we bumped it from 4 mana 2/2 to 5 mana 3/4, and it just kind of stuck. Let's move on to Storm of Forms. 3 and a blue for an instant. When you cast this spell, copy it for each kind of counter among permanents you control. You may choose new targets for the copy, so counter Storm or something like that. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Talk to me about Storm of Forms.
So the playtest name for this card was Drowning in Paperwork, and it was really designed to be a straight-on most brokers card we could imagine. Perry's theme is on full display here, where it cares about the number of different kinds of counters. And whenever we make a commander that cares about something brand new and kind of weird, we always try to put a couple of new cards into the deck that help to support the theme. And this here is one of them. That being said, as we're making these cards, we also are trying to think about, hey, what could these cards have some applications in decks beyond the pre-con? Does anyone other than Perry want to play this card? And for Storm of Forms in particular, I think you'll find it's not too tricky to have 2 or 3 kinds of counters, even in a commander that maybe isn't trying very hard. There's tons of artifacts or lands that have charge counters, storage counters. You've got some planeswalkers in play. And of course, many creatures enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters. So this card, even in a deck that isn't designed to fully maximize it, could still maybe bounce 3-ish permanents for 4 mana. That's not that bad of a deal. So we really liked making this card to be a powerhouse in the pre-con, but also to have some utility beyond it as well.
That's a really good point. I actually hadn't even considered till now about how often commander decks will just end up with counters on them, right? There's so many +1/+1 counters lying around, but also charge counters and, just even loyalty counters on your planeswalkers that this can get copied from. So maybe a little more flexible and goes in a lot more decks than you might think at first glance. And I think that's a good place for a commander card to be, right? You look at it, you can discover more stuff to do with it over time. Moving into green, we've got another great name. I will say I'm sad that the Drowning in Paperwork name did not stick, because that playtest name was so good. But speaking of one playtest name that did stick, and I think is delightful, is Bribetaker, which is 5 green for a 6/6 Rhino Warrior with trample. When Bribetaker enters the battlefield, for each kind of counter on permanents you control, you may put your choice of a +1/+1 counter or a counter of that kind on Bribetaker. What's up with this card?
Right. So similar to the previous card, Storm of Forms, Bribetaker is another one of those cards that is really right on top of the pre-con theme. It is really rewarding you for having lots of different kinds of counters. We went through a number of different versions of this card. Many versions were essentially a large creature that copied counters onto itself. But one of the things that's kind of annoying about that is that it'll end up with a charge counter and a loyalty counter and a hoofprint counter, and none of these things do anything. And what's even worse is that sometimes you'll take a negative counter, like a -1/-1 counter, and it's like, oh, well, I wish that I didn't have that. So we basically allow you to convert those useless counters that might not do very much into +1/+1 counters and make this a very large creature in the right deck.
I think another really important thing about this card too is, on top of all the just cool mechanical stuff going on, it's just a big creature that can end the game. And in a lot of our commander precons, we're always looking for a few new big creatures that will just help end the game. And given that this deck can dirtle around a lot, like putting counters on your stuff and getting cool bonuses, and Perry helps out, but it's nice to just have, hey, this is a 6 mana 6/6 trample. There's probably going to be like a 10/10 or 12/12 or something that can just bash your opponent's faces in, and has a shield counter on it probably to boot, right? So really nice to have that here. Moving along, we have Family's Favor, 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever you attack, put a shield counter on target attacking creature. Until end of turn, it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, remove a shield counter from it. If you do, draw a card. I know this one went through a lot of iteration. And it ended up in kind of an interesting spot. So talk to me about this.
Right. So when it comes to Family's Favor, this used to be a enchantment that drew you a lot more cards. That was sort of the primary thing that it was doing. In the same way that SNC Commander sort of marks a new age of white card draw, it also represents some of us shifting, pulling back a little bit on green's card draw. Green is still going to be able to draw a lot of cards, but we would really prefer that the green card draw focus on, having large creatures or things that are more particular to green, as opposed to some previous versions which just cared about any creatures at all, which is something that we thought was a little bit too broad for the green space. So a lot of the power in this card shifted away from drawing multiple cards and into giving your opponents a tough choice between blocking your shield countered creature and probably losing the creature they're blocking with, or allowing you to draw a card every turn.
I think that's a really great distinction of kind of how we're looking at green drawing cards. You can use your big creatures to draw cards, but not necessarily just draw tons and tons of cards for just having creatures. That makes a lot of sense to me for a green direction here.
Family's Favor is an example of maybe a little kind of a more subtle version of that, where it doesn't necessarily call out that you have to have large creatures, and in fact works on literally any creature, but the larger, more threatening creatures you have, the less likely, or the easier it will be for you to attack people and sort of eat whatever thing they have to throw in front of it.
Right, and trample, for example, a very common green mechanic, awesome on this card, right? Just helps you punch through and make sure you'll be able to draw that card. Well, speaking of, a little earlier we talked about returning mechanics. Here's one with 2 returning mechanics on 1 card, Park Heights Maverick. 2 green for a 2/2 human soldier with Dethrone. And if you aren't up to date with your Conspiracy 1 mechanics, Dethrone means whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, put a +1/+1 counter on it, so it wants to keep hitting the player who's in the lead. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and whenever it deals damage to a player or dies, you proliferate. What is the story here?
Park Heights Maverick is a very interesting card, and I think it's deceptively strong. I think a lot of people haven't yet gotten to see it in play. The origin of this card was at the beginning of the product. We wrote down a list of sort of what are some tropes that we want to hit for each of these different factions based on the theme of that faction. And so for the broker, since they're lawyer themed, we wanted this idea of the young upstart lawyer, like the new, prosecutor who is like trying to bring down the big criminals. And we thought Dethrone was a really fun mechanic to do that with, kind of taking the person who's at top down a peg. And of course puts a +1/+1 counter on you, so it works well with the theme of the deck. The thing that's interesting about this card, and that is often called out, is when it deals combat damage to a player or dies. That isn't a line of text that we often see on Magic cards. And the way that we got here was basically, we like the idea of a card that could hit people repeatedly and proliferate, similar to Thrumming Bird and other such cards that we mentioned earlier. But one of the things is that when you have a non-evasive creature, I mean, Park Heights Maverick does have Daunt, but it's a little easier to block than a Thrumming Bird, for example. One of the things that can happen is that those creatures suddenly become ineffective because they can never get through and connect with an opponent. We like the idea that a dies trigger essentially said, hey, if you block me and I die, I still get to proliferate. So if I'm in play, I'm going to get to do my cool thing, regardless of if it's early in the game and there aren't very many blockers, or it's later in the game and there are a lot of large creatures in play.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's going to be a 3-mana 3/3 attacking right away. And if it connects, it's going to be a 4/4, so it can grow really fast. And then, it can proliferate up your stuff when it dies. I remember early on, we did talk about doing more proliferate, but we found that proliferating shield counters in particular was really, really, really strong. So I know that we pulled back on that a little bit, but there's still a little bit left around here.
Of course, in the wilds of Commander, people can build their proliferate shield counters deck as much as they want, but we didn't want that to be the primary way that people were experiencing the mechanic when they bought these pre-constructed decks.
So we've got Dethrone and proliferate here. I'm curious for everyone out there, which mechanic do you want to see Chris try and tackle next? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see what we can try and get into the next set. Maybe banding will finally make its return. Who knows?
That one, I'm not sure if even I could bring it back.
Technically speaking, I did get the last banding card made in the banding sliver from Mystery Booster playtest cards, so I might keep that throne for a little while. We'll see what happens. Let's move on to one of my favorite cards in the whole set, Agent's Toolkit. 1 green/blue for an artifact dash clue, so nice little nod there. It of course does have the clue ability of you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to draw a card, but the rest is a little more exciting. Agent's Toolkit enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a shield counter. Now, why does my artifact have all these counters, you might ask? Well, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may move a counter from Agent's Toolkit onto that creature. What an awesome design. I love that it comes in with all these counters and you get to go spread them out. Maybe Scott came up with this, maybe you did. I can't remember, but it's a sweet card. Tell me about this. It's delightful.
I think it was me, but I can't remember. It was a while ago and the reason why it was a while ago is because this card was basically made one of the first cards we ever thought of, and it almost never changed. Maybe a couple of tiny tweaks here and there, but this card is really a combination of a bunch of interesting things. So first of all, it's a blue-green card. Each of these decks has exactly one enemy color card. Because this is a 3-color sort of shard set, with the colors where the colors are allied with the colors next to each other. The main set has a bunch of ally colored gold cards, but it has 0 enemy colored cards. And we thought, we're the commander decks. Let's make one of each just for fun. So this is the enemy colored card from the Brokers deck. Second, this is another card that was inspired by that trope list we made at the very beginning. So one of the things we wrote down was, you need like the briefcase that has all of the stuff, when the agent shows up, maybe to get the job done or clean up a mess or something. We liked having that like toolkit hidden inside of the briefcase. So we really wanted to do that. And we wanted to make some new keyword counter cards. And all these things came together to make this one awesome design. I think it's super flavorful. It's super fun to play with. It works well in the pre-con, but it also works perfectly fine in any other deck that likes having counters, especially fun to proliferate. And the last tiny touch that I think makes this card like truly delightful is it being a clue. Because one of the things we found is that, hey, once they take all the counters off this, it's just a dead artifact sitting around, doesn't do anything. And we were like, what would be great is if it was a clue and you could sack it at the end. So ultimately, I agree. This is one of my favorite cards in the whole deck, and I look forward to seeing more of it out in the wild.
I remember fondly in playtesting that Scott cast this card early in playtesting so many times, and it's so good with Perry. Like when you play this into Perry, it makes your whole deck sing. That at one point we're like, Scott, you gotta stop. If you draw Agent's Toolkit early, you gotta just cycle it or something, because we all know the deck's insane if you have Agent's Toolkit on turn 3 every game, right? Because you play this on turn 3, you play Perry on turn 4, and suddenly you've got 4 kinds of counters right away. Not to mention if you had a charge counter land or something. So I remember this is if you were playing this deck and you draw your opening hand and it's got Agent's Toolkit and some lands, you are going to be golden. It's going to turn on all your stuff.
Right. It's really good with Perry, but I will also mention that I remember a playtest where someone drew this, and I think this was a playtest where we weren't testing Perry. We were testing a different commander. They played this early and they just were able to play out their creatures, give them flying and death touch and stuff, and then sack to draw a card. And we were like, wow, Perry wasn't even here. And this card was so strong. Flash forward a couple of months, I get a comment in Drake, which is like, this card seems like it could be a little stronger. It seems weak. And I'm like, absolutely not. This card costs the correct amount of mana. It's deceptively powerful, and I'm looking forward to see what people do with it.
And for those of you who don't know what Drake is, it's kind of our multiverse tool where we store all of our cards in. So that people can go through and leave comments on stuff. So sometimes you'll be surfing through your set, checking out what's going on, and someone will just walked by and left a comment, which I always appreciate, but it is sometimes funny if someone's never played with the card and they're like, I think this card could be stronger. And you're like, actually, no, this card, we've had to nerf 4 times already, and it still might be too good. So good times. On to the next card, and this is part of a 5-card cycle across all 5 decks, Broker's Confluence. So the big return of the Confluence mechanic, 2 green, white, blue for an instant. Choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Mode 1, proliferate. So there's some of that proliferating for you. Mode 2, target creature phases out. Mode 3, counter target activated or triggered ability. So glad to see confluences here. I remember trying them as allied colored confluences in Commander Legends 1. Didn't work out for a couple of reasons there. But when we were working on Streets of New Capenna Commander, we wanted to do a cycle, and you can talk about the story there a little bit. But I remember it was, hey, we wanted to do a cycle. Well, hey, confluences have 3 modes. There's 3 colors. Ta-da! What a perfect fit. So, I mean, that's what I remember of these. I know you and I talked about them a bunch, and I was a big fan of doing them. But maybe you have some other fun behind-the-scenes stories.
That's right. So early on, we said, most of the time when we make new cards for Commander, we err towards making monocolored cards because those cards go into as more decks than multicolor cards. That being said, you're doing a 3-color set. You want to make at least a couple 3-color cards. And we wanted to make one cycle. And right, confluences, they seem like the most obvious choice. There's 3 modes on a confluence. Each of them are going to be 3 colors. It felt like a perfect fit. And so, right, we basically these were a huge group effort. I don't think that there's any cards in the file that were more collaborative in terms of everyone pitching lots of different ideas, different modes, talking about which modes were too strong, too weak, changing the costs. Everything about these cards changed. It took us a long time to try and get them right. And ultimately, the thing about confluences is that they're so flexible, they're so modal. You'll never get them to be perfectly balanced, but they have so much flexibility that even if one mode gets chosen more than the others, for example, Broker's Confluence, I think will oftentimes be cast to proliferate 3 times, which is a very powerful, very exciting effect. But at the end of the day, there's no problem with that. It is a card that lets you proliferate a bunch, but also has some other flexibility in different situations. And so I really liked how the various confluences came together to have lots of different choices for you, depending on what's going on in the game. One other thing I'll call out on Broker's Confluence is the use of phasing. Phasing is something that is very old, but also relatively new, and that we've only brought it back in the past couple of years. But this deck is a great example of why we actually like using phasing occasionally, because unlike, exiling your creatures and returning them, phasing allows you to keep all of the counters on your creatures. So in any other set, we might just exile your creatures and bring them back. In fact, that might even be better for some creatures with end of the battlefield effects. But in this deck, where all your creatures have counters on them, and it's really important that you keep those counters on there, phasing is the perfect way to protect your own creatures, but not lose all of the progress that you've made.
I know with this card in particular, I'm very greedy in that I'm like, I could triple proliferate now, but I always want to save it to phase something out in response to a wrath, or counter. The dream is to counter an activate or trigger ability, right? It's you're going to do something, you're actually no, counter it, proliferate twice. Even if it's wrong, I just love doing it. It's too fun. It's too fun.
The value you gain from surprising someone with one of the modes and then also proliferating, I think it's difficult to give that up.
It's definitely got big cryptic command energy of oh, you cast your spell in your first main phase? Well, I've got bad news for you. You're definitely not attacking me this turn, right? Okay, and our last and final card here, I do remember this is a Scott Larrabee design, Gavel of the Righteous. This is an artifact. Now, every deck has one artifact in it. This is the one for the Broker's deck, or one colorless artifact, I should say. It's 2 mana for an equipment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a charge counter on Gavel of the Righteous. An equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each counter on it. Additionally, as long as it has 4 or more counters on it, equipped creature has double strike. So it grows and then eventually gets double strike. It also has a pretty fun equip ability. You can pay 3 mana or remove a counter from Gavel of the Righteous to equip it. So as it gains these counters, if you have extra counters, no problem. You can shove one off and equip it to a creature for free. Talk to me about this card.
Yeah, so if you look at the art for Perry the Pulverizer, you will see in his hand a large warhammer shaped like a judge's gavel. And when we saw that in the concept art, we were like, that is awesome. That should be what we make this artifact slot. And this idea of an equipment that gets better over time was something that we were really fond of, especially since it allowed us to introduce another charge counter card into the deck, which we wanted to make at least one new charge counter card. We thought that would be a fun thing to do. Right. This just idea of an equipment that is powering up over time that you can proliferate to speed it up. I think that this card definitely can fly under the radar. It's a little bit slow to get going, but if you are in commander games that oftentimes go a little bit long or that get into a middle stage of the game where people aren't attacking as much, this card will really help you burst through some of those. And also it will continue to be just as powerful even if all of your creatures get removed. The next creature you play out, the gavel will be charged up and ready to go.
And in Commander, which is often such a mana constrained format, that free equip is so meaningful. I can really imagine this seeing a lot of play in equipment heavy decks because your mana is so tied up, spending mana to equip everything, that having that free equip is a pretty big deal on this card. So cool design there. We've come a long way from Banshee's Blade, which is the Mirrodin artifact does this for just 1/1/1, basically. You get to get a charge counter whenever you hit them with the creature or something like that. Anyway, long way for Banshee's Blade. Well, there you have it. There are all 17 new cards in the Brokers deck, a bit of retrospective on the deck. Chris, before we wrap, anything you want to close out with? Anything you want to say about the deck in particular?
Ultimately, I think that the deck is super fun. I'm super looking forward to seeing people build with Perrie in the wild and show me what kinds of crazy counters. I mean, we found a lot of cool counters and we couldn't include all of them. I'm looking forward to seeing the people who do try to fit in just as many different kinds of counters as they want. The one other thing I'll say about the deck in terms of the reprints is that each of these decks, we picked one existing 3-color commander to sort of be like a bonus reprint legend. And for this deck, it was Janara, Asura of War, which is a sort of like, a long time classic band commander. Hasn't really been at the forefront for a long time, but it was really awesome to see some of these old time commanders come back and sort of play a supporting role, playing in with the deck theme.
Great, yeah, and really cool to see that back. I remember playing Janara back when I was starting to play Commander. So those Shards of Alara commanders going a long way, and fun to see them repeated back here again. Well, thanks everyone so much for watching this episode and kind of getting the download on the Brokers deck. If you want to see more episodes, we've got 4 more decks to cover. Let us know if you want to see more and what you want us to do next in the comments down below. And if there's enough excitement, maybe Chris and I will fire this up and do another one. We'll see exactly how it goes. In the meantime, though, may you have a lot of fun playing with the Brokers deck. It was a blast to put together, a blast to work on, and I really hope you all enjoy it. I'll talk with you again very soon. And remember, everybody, you got this.
The final format is called Winchester Draft. Why Winchester? Well, it's a hybrid between Winston and Rochester. Fair enough, I suppose. The idea here is to create a bit more choice than 2-player Rochester has, while making it go faster than Winston. Here's how it works. Like the other formats, you open the packs, shuffle them, make one draft.